The enemy is cruel, ruthless, and relentless. We must not underestimate the danger. We must be vigilant and valiant.
In the last decade, far-right and neo-fascist groups have more frequently come into the public eye. From the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol just a few weeks ago, it seems that right-wing extremism is alive and abundant here in the U.S. I often wonder how it is that these right-wing groups amass such a large following, and how do they recruit? What spurs people to readily join the cause? Today, I'll be taking a dive into a movement that is surprisingly used by the far right as a pipeline for recruitment: NoFap. Anti-masturbation rhetoric has been around for centuries, and within the last 200 years has been effectively weaponized as a tool to radicalize young men. Why is NoFap such an easy way for the far right to recruit? Well, let's get into it. Before we get into today's video, I'd like to say a few things. This video is intended to clear up any misconceptions surrounding masturbation and analyzing how anti-masturbation rhetoric is used by far-right groups to radicalize young men. I'm not claiming that abstaining from masturbation makes someone a far-right radical, only that far-right groups use NoFap to garner more followers. Throughout this video, I will be using the words fap or fapping interchangeably with masturbation, mostly because it becomes tiring to repeat and listen to. Additionally, this video will also be primarily looking at how these tactics affect men. Your opinions on fapping are your own, and this video isn't intended to try and persuade you one way or another. As a fair warning, I will be talking about some sensitive topics. I will be discussing things like racism, eugenics, child abuse, fascism, homophobia, the Holocaust, and masturbating. And that last one quite a bit too. While these topics may be difficult to talk about, they are very important in understanding the history of NoFap and how it became another tool in the far-right radicalization shed. In addition to my analysis, I will be including a list, with links if available, of all my sources in the description below. I encourage you to hear my arguments out regardless of your views surrounding NoFap, and I thank you for your time today.
What did you do last night?
Well, I went home, took a shower, masturbated, went to sleep.
I'd like to start things off today by looking at what the scientific and medical communities have to say about masturbation. The Fap Facts, if you will. The medical consensus is that masturbation is a medically healthy and psychologically normal habit. The Merck Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy considers it to be abnormal only when it inhibits partner-oriented behavior, is performed in public, or is sufficiently compulsive to cause self-distress. Regarding the physical effects of masturbation, in 1972, the American Medical Association formally declared that fapping is normal, and that it does not deplete the body of energy or induce PME. Additionally, in 2003, a research team affiliated with the Cancer Council Australia found that men who fapped frequently had a lower probability of developing prostate cancer. However, they were unable to find a direct causation between the two. One of the oddest study results came in 2008 at Tabriz Medical University. They conducted a study and found that regularly fapping reduces swollen nasal blood vessels and in turn frees one's airway for normal breathing through stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. In conjunction, the author also proposed that the frequency of the act can be adjusted depending on how severely one's restricted breathing is. Pretty nifty tip there for allergies, I mean, if you were curious, that is. When it comes to mental health, masturbation is believed to help alleviate depression and raise self-esteem. This is mostly an anecdotal observation, albeit a very common and frequently observed one. In addition, rubbing one out usually relaxes men and is followed by drowsiness and sleep, which some appreciate. This is due to a drop in blood pressure and a release of endorphins post-nut. And before you ask, yes, there are fapping-related risks. So let's go over a few real quick. In the event that a man rubs one too hard, they can fracture their member or eventually develop Peyronie's disease. Granted, about 10% of men will develop Peyronie's disease in their lifetime, and the mean age of onset is 55 to 60 years old. You can think of it as like extreme wear and tear over the course of 50 years. The main risks that we'll be seeing pop up again and again are compulsive behaviors. Non-stop masturbation, or as I like to call it, a fapathon, is a nervous habit, and the consensus on it is to treat the cause of the compulsion instead of repressing masturbation. And now that we have a better understanding of the medicine, let's go back in time and see how people thought of fapping 200 years ago.
If you're a little guy like me, with lots of growing to do, who'd like to shoot up strong and tall. Here's my advice to you.
In 1829, a man named Sylvester Graham invented everyone's favorite go-to s'mores cracker, the graham cracker. Graham was a puritanical minister who not only despised sex, but falsely asserted that lustful thoughts and self-pleasure would lead to a myriad of ailments, like headaches, seizures, and mental insanity. In his young adult life, he preached that intercourse, materialism, and gluttony could cause people to become sick. Out of everything, though, the worst in his book was fapping. Along with eating tasty foods, he believed that fapping exacerbated sexual urges that ultimately led to self-abuse. He became a vegetarian and launched a crusade against meat, suggesting that it induces primal instincts, and then devoted his time to creating a small snack that was intended to be the exact opposite of tasty food, something so bland that it would even lower your sex drive. This would only last about 60 years though, when Nabisco eventually purchased the rights to the graham cracker and radically altered its recipe with sugar and cinnamon. This was the cracker that, along with chocolate and marshmallows, defined the s'more, everyone's favorite campfire treat. Graham, however, wasn't the only guy trying to fight FAP with food. The ideas that intertwined food, religion, and sex were very popular during the 19th century. One of the most well-known followers of Graham's ideology was Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, and yes, that Kellogg. In 1878, Kellogg created granola cereal in an attempt to emulate what Graham did with his snack. He was a doctor, businessman, eugenicist, and devout Seventh-day Adventist, who founded the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1866. He followed the clean living movement, a movement that pushed temperance, prohibition, and by association, purity and social hygiene. Part of his mission was to create and promote anaphrodisiac foods that, when combined with only 2 meals a day, would reduce and discourage sexual feelings. He devoted a lot of his time and education to discouraging sexual activity based on the knowledge at the time of sexually transmissible diseases and the teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was a leader of the anti-masturbation, i.e. NoFap, movement of the time, where he encouraged and promoted radical methods of preventing masturbation. These began with binding the hands of children, caging their pelvic regions, ice baths, and electroshock therapy, but ultimately led to much more serious procedures. Eventually, acid burning, starvation, genital mutilation without anesthetic, and the use of blistering agents all became common practice for Kellogg and his sanitarium. Why were these methods so barbaric, you might ask? Well, Kellogg was so invested in the 19th century NoFap scene that he promoted outrageous claims made by doctors and even theologians that compared fapping to crippling diseases. Adam Clarke, a Methodist theologian and biblical scholar who Kellogg frequently cited, stated that neither the plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor similar diseases have produced results so disastrous to humanity as the pernicious habit of Owenism. Today, it's comical to suggest that these assertions are the least bit correct, especially that part about war, because that becomes very relevant in just a moment. Kellogg even went as far as to assert that fapping could cause cancer, impotence, and even the classic dimness of vision myth. But the nail in the coffin was his claim that fapping could kill. It would eat away at one's physical and mental health, but most importantly, their moral health, eventually causing one to literally die by his own hand. He considered self-pleasure to be the worst evil one could commit, and that it was a horrendous form of self-abuse. Kellogg's other medical beliefs, such as germ theory, abstention from alcohol and tobacco, and the importance of exercise and a healthy diet, were considered to be ahead of their time and gained him significant credibility in the medical community. However, that meant that his other very disturbing beliefs were also granted a similar level of credibility. Kellogg was a firm supporter of racial segregation in the United States and believed that immigrants and non-whites would damage the gene pool. I feel gross even by just reading those statements. Oddly enough, though, he did raise several black foster children despite his concerns about what he considered to be racial degeneracy. In 1906, he co-founded the Race Betterment Foundation, an American eugenics and racial hygiene organization dedicated to spreading propaganda around the dangers of race mixing. The RBF established a eugenics registry in 1915 whose 4 main goals were as follows: 1. To make an inventory and record of the socially important hereditary traits and tendencies of the individual. 2. To point out as far as possible the conditions under which these traits and tendencies may express themselves in succeeding generations. 3. To contribute to the growth and spread of our knowledge of natural inheritance in man. And 4. To assist in the maintenance and increase of natural endowments and to combat race decay. This registry collected information from thousands of families for 20 years, but was interrupted by major global events such as the Great Depression and the Second World War, and the not-so-major event that was Kellogg's death in 1943. After World War II, the pseudoscientific ideas of race betterment and eugenics became unacceptable concepts within both the academic and medical communities, due in large part to the Holocaust carried out during the war. And if you thought that the war on fapping ended with Kellogg, I have some pretty bad news for you. It didn't.
Shown the first installment of the indictment which the Nazi propaganda film unwittingly makes against itself. Here in the second, we see further evidence of the ruthless Nazi war machine in action on the...
Despite the title of this section, this is where we transition to a more serious and disturbing point in world history, and where the link between NoFap and the far right cements itself. In January of 1933, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany, forming what is formally known as the German Reich, or more commonly known as Nazi Germany. Germany was transformed into a totalitarian state under the control of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and thus formed one of the Axis powers during the Second World War, more commonly known as the World Anti-Fascist War in the Eastern/Pacific Theater. But first, let's look at some context surrounding the European far-right movement in the first half of the 20th century. Racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and eugenics were all pillars within the Nazi belief system that have since bled into the neo-fascist and far-right communities of today. After the First World War, the Allied powers heavily punished the Central Powers, and the German Empire took the biggest beating, being then transformed into the Weimar Republic. The Treaty of Versailles is the most famous and most important peace treaty of World War I, and it helped to bring an end to the war. The reason this treaty is so important to what we're talking about today was because it helped pave the way for ultranationalism to grow in Germany. The treaty declared that Germany had to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage that had occurred over the last 4 years. On top of that, though, it forced Germany to reduce and disarm its military, give up land conquered and previously owned, and pay approximately 132 billion gold marks in gold, services, military technology, and other goods. Just to put that in perspective, that's about $33 billion today. As you can imagine, this had a big impact on the German economy at the time, but was not the sole reason it suffered. The stock market crash of 1929 also played a big role in its decline, and in 1931, Germany had a debt of approximately 21.5 billion marks. That's the equivalent of about $5.38 billion today. But this treaty was above all else a major political humiliation for Germany. All of this, combined with the anger harbored by neighboring European countries, paved the way for someone to come and reinvigorate German morale. This is where the Nazis come in. The Nazis built their platform on the complete rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, the vilification of Bolshevism, the destruction of the current Weimar Republic, and perhaps most well-known, rampant anti-Semitism. Among their promises to the German people was increasing German land ownership, radical racial cleansing of the population, and the systematic segregation and the eventual genocide of the Jewish people. However, there were other policies aimed at German people concerning purity, health, and temperance in society. While many Christian groups did indeed oppose the Nazi regime, they were suppressed, had their leaders imprisoned, and were replaced by a coalition of existing Protestant churches. This became known as the Unified Protestant Reich Church, who was supported and eventually led by the pro-Nazi group dubbed German Christians. They disavowed the Old Testament due to its Jewish origins, but was eventually abandoned by the Nazis in 1937 after being met with strong opposition from the newly formed Confessing Church. Prior to this, Catholic churches were persecuted and political Catholicism, along with all other opposing political parties, was eliminated. Just like Kellogg in the United States, the Nazis had a strong anti-tobacco movement, and German doctors helped pioneer research linking tobacco smoking to lung cancer. An emphasis was made on exercise and proper nutrition to improve the health of German citizens, and they even led one of the earliest campaigns in favor of removing mercury and lead from consumer products. Even more surprisingly, the Nazi government instituted government-run healthcare plans, exclusively to non-Jewish citizens, of course, and German women were strongly encouraged to undergo routine breast cancer screenings. But still, that doesn't make up for everything else the Nazis did. Conquering 40% of Europe and executing over 17 million people. But this leads us into the next major bridge connecting NoFap and the far right, the role of women within their families and in German society. The Nazis vehemently opposed feminism and dismissed it as Jewish propaganda aimed at subverting German women in society. Despite these outrageous and silly conspiracies, women were considered a cornerstone of Nazi Germany's social policy. They advocated for establishing a patriarchal society and insisted that a woman should understand that her world is her husband, her children, and her home. At the time, this was colloquially recognized in German by the phrase, and please forgive me for my pronunciation here, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, or in English, children, kitchen, church. Again, sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. The Nazis wanted to make women, mostly mothers, a priority in their rhetoric. They insisted on bringing back family values of the past, sounds familiar, doesn't it, into society and pushed for women to stay at home and only concern themselves with housework and family care. This was important, and we'll get back to why and how it relates to contemporary radicalization later on. Now, let's finally discuss how the Nazis handled November's most controversial question. To fap or not to fap? Human sexuality and Nazi social policy were both tightly knit. The regime's overall goal wasn't to suppress and demonize sexuality, but instead they wanted to reserve it for who they believed were worthy of its privilege. So in their case, people exclusively of the Aryan race. This is most closely mirrored in 19th century America through the use of forced abortions, involuntary sterilization, mass murder to control reproduction, and more importantly, reserve the right to sexual pleasure to exclusively white people. Like what we saw in 19th century America, according to Dagmar Herzog, in a textbook she wrote in 2011, Nazis embraced eugenics and believed that the Jewish people, quote, were responsible for the sexual immorality that pervaded Weimar culture, unquote. The Nazis led a massive campaign against public immorality and sexual degeneracy. This resulted in shutting down gay and lesbian bars, nudist groups, brothels, and other organizations that didn't promote chastity or what they believed was moral sexual practice. But this didn't happen right away. In the mid-1930s, Nazi leadership was becoming more and more concerned with being perceived as queer by the public. The growing number of same-sex institutions, especially amongst the youth, fostered suspicions of homoerotic behavior, and in response, the entire regime went above and beyond to prove their heteronormative beliefs. In fact, until then, there was hardly any perceived hostility between far-right groups and those advocating equal rights for homosexuals. These fears grew so much and so rapidly that in 1935, mutual masturbation, parallel individual masturbation, and yes, even erotic glances at others began to fall under penalty of law. This led to radical penalties on homosexual behaviors by 1937 and the prosecution of over 100,000 men whose anger was immediately exploited by the regime. Many, but certainly not all, advocates for the legalization of homosexuality were Jewish, and their roles as leaders made them easy targets for the Nazis and only helped further vilify homosexual behavior. These changes happened very rapidly when Heinrich Himmler rose to the Nazi ranks. He was extremely homophobic and pushed to enforce penalties for gay men, but not for gay women. This seems kind of odd, but it begins to make more sense as we explore his mindset. He believed in and promoted one of the most classic far-right beliefs, that birth rates were too low, and thus they couldn't firmly secure the future of the Aryan race. And the only way to stop that was to have more children and at a faster rate. So Himmler advocated that since monogamous marriages couldn't produce enough children, the solution was to incorporate polygamy into the German family structure. The war ended before these practices could be put into place, but it illustrates how men in the Nazi social structure viewed women, primarily as a commodity, servant, and as a child bearer. So to summarize what we've learned, the Nazi regime was focused on increasing Nazi Germany's birth rate as to produce more Aryan children. This necessitated coercing women into traditional gender roles and eliminating sexual practices that either did not lead to an increase in Aryan birth rate or that encouraged sexually deviant behavior amongst young men. Behaviors they considered to be sexually deviant include gay relationships, race mixing, women working outside of the home, and you guessed it, fapping. But how did they get away with this? How are they able to vilify masturbation so easily and on such a scale that young men could actually be prosecuted for doing it? It all goes back to the core belief at the heart of all far-right movements, ideologies, and conspiracy theories. Virulent anti-Semitism. By masquerading fapping as an inherently Jewish act, the Nazis were able to simply dismiss fapping as a perverted sexual behavior perpetrated by the Jewish people to pervert German society and subvert what they considered to be traditional family values. It's the mindset of, if you engage in this act, you are just one of them and not one of us. This was, for the first time, how a far-right and ultra-nationalist group was able to weaponize masturbation by incorrectly associating it with Jewish identity in order to radicalize young men to their cause. And it brings us to how NoFap is used in the 21st century and how it evolved to expand its reach.
You could pirate it or get it for free, and it went from like an innocent curiosity about the female form to an out-of-control compulsion.
On June 20th, 2011, Alexander Rhodes launched a subreddit and later a website known as NoFap. Its creation was dedicated to being a support group for men who wanted to stop consuming pornography and, well, fapping. What prompted Rhodes to do so was a Chinese study from 2003 that claimed men who refrain from masturbation for 7 days experience a 145.7% spike in testosterone levels on the 7th day. However, the study also mentions that no regular fluctuation was observed following continuous abstinence after the peak. Reasons for no-fapping range from person to person, but 3 important driving factors for men are self-improvement, religious or moral beliefs, and unfortunately, physical benefits that are not supported by modern medicine. One of the biggest endeavors the group has taken on is the battle against pornography addiction. These efforts have been criticized as simplistic, outdated, and incorrect by neuroscientists, psychologists, and several others within the medical community. The primary pseudoscience that NoFap cites and promotes originates from Gary Wilson, an anti-porn activist who has no scientific training or background and who has made a career peddling pseudoscience. On the surface, NoFap presents itself as a personal choice for men who feel they struggle with pornography consumption and excessive masturbation that ultimately leads them to suffering in their personal relationships. The core issue with the NoFap community isn't for the most part its members and their desire to stop whatever habits they might be engaging in. The problem is that the community is pushing medical information that is flat out incorrect, information that in the past was used as propaganda, information like fapping weakens the male spirit, leads to erectile dysfunction, and is immoral. These are examples of 3 kinds of misinformation: anecdotal, incorrect, and subjective. The only kind of information that can even be remotely helpful to others is anecdotal, but even then, your mileage may vary. Many critics of NoFap as an organization argue that the movement rejects the scientific consensus on the health effects of masturbation. Members claim that they feel they have increased energy, more focus, and better sleep, without there being concrete scientific evidence. If you feel better by not fapping, then by all means do what works for you. But it is disingenuous to propagate misinformation to recruit others by masking anecdotal evidence as scientific. In an article published by Christoph Kurl in 2020, he states that NoFap has also been the target of far-right groups. He specifically mentions the struggle for the re-masculinization of white men by overcoming porn had to be an anti-Semitic one, a fight against quote-unquote Jewish pornography and quote-unquote Jewish filth, in which other current anti-porn actors such as NoFap should join. This is very reminiscent of Nazi ideology, and yet again, another example of how far-right groups use the NoFap movement as a recruitment tool. But it doesn't mean that all NoFappers are also far-right radicals. NoFap shares supporters with something called the Manosphere. What is the Manosphere, you might ask? Well, it's a collection of websites, blogs, and online forums promoting some forms of masculinity, hostility towards women, a strong opposition to feminism, and exaggerated misogyny. You might know it better as the Red Pill movement. Movements frequently associated with the Manosphere include inceldom, men going their own way, and other general men's rights groups. The Manosphere has been politically associated with the far right and is further explored by Donna Zuckerberg in her book, Not All Dead White Men. She writes, "The Red Pill represents a new phase in online misogyny. Its members not only mock and belittle women, they also believe that in our society, men are oppressed by women. This further exposes the connection between NoFap and other groups with far-right ties. Misogyny and remasculinization are two of the first steps in far-right recruitment. But this exposes another avenue through which hateful rhetoric travels: the internet. The existence of communities like the manosphere within the web allow for far-right ideologies to substantially increase their reach. For the first time, you don't have to go to the rally to hear the message. You don't need to be associated with the far right in your public life. You can instead watch from the comfort of your own home. Young men can just check it out or dip their toes into far-right circles without ever having to be seen at a neo-Nazi rally. And this ability to look in from afar and not suffer the consequences of associations is what makes spreading this ideology so easy. But how do these ideas propagate throughout the decades? How do these debunked ideas still manage to recruit followers? Well, historically, figures and groups who advocated for the NoFap concept have also been on the cutting edge of medicine. This is how the puzzle pieces finally come together. Graham and Kellogg both strongly argued the benefits of vegetarianism and the health problems that came with excessive meat consumption, tobacco smoking, and drinking alcohol. They were proponents and supporters of germ theory, something that was heavily disputed in the medical community at the time, but is now an established fact that has saved countless lives and helped decrease the spread of various diseases. Nazi German scientists were among the first to link lung cancer to smoking and push policies that removed toxic and heavy metals from the public water supplies. These practices gave these groups a degree of legitimacy within the medical community and thus provided a platform for their other ideas to garner support in today's world. The statement, well, maybe since they were right about this thing, they were also right about this other thing, best sums up the thought process that prevails in this community. But that statement is exactly the same reason why the NoFap ideology is used by the far right to radicalize and recruit. Graham, Kellogg, and Nazi Germany all pushed the same NoFap rhetoric in tandem with eating healthy, exercising regularly, and casual ethnic cleansing. But all jokes aside, the close association between all these ideas are what effectively brainwashes some men and leads them down the far-right rabbit hole. Let's take it step by step. At first, NoFap is presented as just an outlet for men wanting to improve themselves or for men to seize back control of their willpower and sexual urges. Seems fine, no real problem there. These ideas are then critiqued and questioned. Where is the evidence, you might ask? The evidence is mostly anecdotal, stories from some friends or from something seen on a forum, but it still doesn't have empirical data supporting it, leading to its validity being questioned. Far-right communities then point to how historically, proponents of the NoFap movement have been ahead of their time on all these other things, so it's safe to assume they were also ahead of their time when it comes to masturbation. Impressionable young men then make the link and slowly decide, I'll hear them out. I guess their logic makes sense. This is the point where these young men are caught by these radical groups. When these men decide to validate the debunked NoFap health claims, they transition to validating the other claims made by those like Graham, Kellogg, and the Nazi Party through the same method of association. To be fair, falling for this trick is much easier than you might think. If you're seeking out NoFap, it's safe to assume that you desire to make a big change in your life. You want to know the root of your habit and how to fix it. You're already in a vulnerable mindset that encourages uncovering the truth, that, just like conspiracies, tends to bias these new facts you've never been told about, the truth they've been hiding from you all along. You question that if science and medicine had been lying about the Fap Facts, then what else are they lying about? If you've had fun reading about conspiracy theories, you probably understand what I'm getting at. These men aren't dumb or weak. It can happen to anyone regardless of their beliefs. Now that they have been absorbed into this far-right sphere, they become more open to other ideas proposed by the same figures. Eugenics, misogyny, racism, homophobia, and of course, anti-Semitism to name a few. Far-right conspiracies begin to make more sense to them, and they start to champion the far-right cause. Just the fact that these voices had a degree of authority in the past, or were proposing some ideas that are now validated in medicine, makes it so easy for some people to falsely believe that all of their views or opinions were correct. NoFap propaganda is often the first step in indoctrinating someone into the far-right community, and that is precisely why it's so important to be very aware of where you get your information from. While it's important to know where these roads can lead, what's more important is to understand why they do. The NoFap community is full of these success stories about how they've improved relationships with loved ones, or how NoFap gave them time to pursue hobbies and refocus their time. Those are positive outcomes, and if abstaining from masturbation helps you bond with others or improve yourself, then there isn't anything wrong with that. Guilt and shame are two very powerful emotions that compel people to make radical changes in their lives. In these cases, the answer to why do I NoFap is because my relationships suffer, or because I waste so much of my time. Those are legitimate reasons, and if NoFapping makes you feel better, then there's nothing wrong with it. But being in a vulnerable state of mind makes it easier for one to radicalize. Being told that the root of your problems stem from a specific group of people is always the first step in a genocide. And the same can be seen from the 1800s up to now, and those who browse NoFap and the manosphere as a whole should be very wary of this.
I love to masturbate.
NoFap as a public community has only been active for a little under 10 years now, but the ideas behind the movement have been around for over 200 years. Regardless of how you feel about masturbation in your personal life, I really want to emphasize that not masturbating does not automatically make someone a fascist, right-wing extremist, or a radical. To be clear, what I'm trying to explain is that NoFap as an ideology is a frequent tool used by the far right to recruit young men. Sylvester Graham, John Harvey Kellogg, and Nazi Germany were early examples of how anti-masturbation propaganda was intertwined with racism, eugenics, and fascism. Their past credibility in the medical field platformed their other far-right views, and the association between these ideas is what makes radicalizing people so easy. While many in the NoFap community probably have good intentions, intentionally promoting false information about masturbation is wrong and actively harmful to others. It's dangerous to preach pseudoscience, and it delegitimizes the entire NoFap community. If NoFap wants to continue to serve as a community for people who have difficulty with and want help monitoring their personal sexual habits, then okay, keep on doing that. Be there for people who need help. But the information it provides needs to be medically accurate, and it really needs to stop fostering misogynistic and anti-Semitic ideas. I still believe that the initial intentions of the NoFap community were positive, but over time things have changed. What was once a group trying to help men has since been infiltrated and used by the far right. And that's my take on the connection between NoFap and the far right, and thus concludes this video. Let me know what your thoughts are on this subject down below, and please consider liking this video if you learned something. I had a great time making this video, and thank you to my friend Micah for the topic suggestion. This was a good bit longer than my last video, but I do hope I helped shed some light on a controversial subject. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for tuning in today.